Somebody tell this museum fossil the firing line isn't a retirement home. The desert range pulsed with heat as shimmering waves rose off the sand, bending the air like glass over a flame, while young Marine snipers stood in a rough semicircle, laughing too loudly at jokes meant to impress each other as the old man stepped onto the coarse gravel with slow, deliberate boots, drawing an immediate ripple of disdain from the sunburned faces watching him breathe without hurry, without apology, without needing their approval. The antagonist, Staff Sergeant Riker, smirked openly as he circled the veteran like a shark testing weak flesh, brushing past his shoulder hard enough to shift dust from the man's faded jacket while the younger Marines held their breath, half thrilled and half uncomfortable, wondering if this gray-haired stranger even understood how insulted he'd just been on military soil. But the old man didn't flinch, and that terrified them more than they admitted. The desert seemed to pause, waiting for what the old man would do next. Riker let the silence stretch as if he owned it, rolling his shoulders back, letting the sun hit his perfectly pressed uniform while the old veteran simply adjusted his stance, palms resting lightly against his thighs, posture straight despite the years carved into his bones. The younger Marines shifted uneasily, their boots grinding the gravel in small guilty circles as they watched the imbalance of power widen in front of them, the humiliation growing thicker than the heat. Riker stepped even closer, close enough that his breath fogged across the veteran's cheek, and he chuckled low, the kind of laugh meant to bruise pride rather than amuse. He made a show of glancing at the veteran's worn boots, then up at his weathered face as if cataloging every flaw for sport. A few Marines forced smirks, but their eyes kept flicking back to the old man, waiting for him to break or snap or protest, anything to make the tension feel less like a vice tightening around all of them. But the veteran remained utterly still, like a stone shaped by storms that no longer impressed him. A faint breeze rolled across the range, tugging dust into small spirals, and the veteran simply inhaled once, calmly, deeply, with a steadiness that made several Marines swallow hard. One of them, a younger lance corporal, whispered to another that something felt off, that no ordinary man would stand this quietly under such open mockery. Riker didn't notice the shift in the air, but everyone else did. They saw discipline, not defeat. Strength, not fear. Silence, not submission. And that silence began to unnerve them more than Riker's words ever could. Something buried in the old man's calm made the range feel suddenly dangerous. Riker planted his boots in front of the firing line as if presenting a lesson in dominance, dragging his finger across the veteran's chest with a mocking tap-tap-tap that made several Marines grimace at the blatant disrespect. The old man didn't react, not a blink, not a breath out of rhythm, which only made Riker push harder, louder, and crueler. He raised his voice so everyone could hear, calling out the veteran's age, his clothes, his posture, and his presence, each insult wrapped in the tone of a man who believed the world revolved around his rank. But beneath all that noise, something else was happening. The veteran's silence wasn't the silence of retreat. It was measured, deliberate, the kind of silence worn only by men who had no need to prove anything because they had already survived what others couldn't imagine. And the young Marines felt it. Their ribcages tightened with unspoken intuition, their eyes catching on the veteran's hands, steady and unshaking, and his gaze calm as winter water. Riker demanded the old man speak, demanded he justify why he was on his range, and demanded he explain what gave him the right to breathe the same dust as Marine snipers. When the veteran finally lifted his eyes, it wasn't defiance that showed. It was something colder, something cleaner, something that made one corporal unconsciously straighten his back. The old man spoke just 4 quiet words, soft enough that only those closest heard, but the weight of them rolled outward like slow thunder. "I'm just here to watch." Somehow, those 4 words hit harder than any argument Riker expected. The range grew uncomfortable again, thicker, tighter, the air stretching between every heartbeat. The younger Marines didn't know why, but they suddenly felt like something enormous had just shifted under the sand at their feet. No one could explain why 4 calm words made even the wind hesitate. If you want the truth behind men like him, follow before the next reveal slips away. The tension had barely settled when the crunch of approaching boots cut through the silence, crisp and decisive, the kind of stride that made Marines instinctively stiffen even before they saw the bars on the collar. Captain Hale stepped into the sunlight with the authority of a man who'd spent half his life on rifle ranges and battlefields, his shadow stretching long across the sand as conversations died in mid-breath. The Marines snapped to attention, spines straight, jaws clenched, but Riker's smirk faltered only slightly, just enough for the closest observers to notice. Hale's gaze swept the line, analyzing posture, rifles, spacing, until it landed on the old veteran. Something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost microscopic, but undeniable. Not recognition. Not yet. but familiarity. As if the veteran's presence pulled at a half-forgotten instinct buried somewhere deep in Hale's memory. Riker launched into a loud explanation, painting the veteran as an intruder, a distraction, and a nobody. But Hale barely listened. His focus lingered on the older man's stance, balanced, grounded, and unconsciously precise. The kind of stance only men with decades of shooting under blistering sun and bone-cutting cold ever learned. A breeze stirred the dust between them as Hale stepped closer, studying the veteran with a quiet intensity that made Riker's confidence crack just a little more. The captain didn't speak right away. He simply looked as though searching for the outline of a ghost he wasn't sure he believed in yet. Across the range, the younger Marine stayed rigid, feeling the shift in power hum like static across the sand. Something larger was moving into place, and every instinct told them they were standing at the edge of a story they'd never forget. The captain's eyes held questions that Riker suddenly didn't want answered. Captain Hale circled the veteran with a slow, deliberate pace, the same way a man inspects a weapon he hasn't touched in years but has never forgotten how to use. Riker watched nervously, shifting his weight from one boot to the other, suddenly unsure whether his earlier bravado had been a mistake. The younger Marines sensed the tension thickening, their eyes bouncing between the captain's expression and the veteran's stillness. Hale finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with a curiosity that carried weight. "Where'd you learn that stance?" he asked, not accusatory, not mocking, but respectful in a way that made Riker stiffen. The veteran didn't rush his answer. He simply lifted his gaze, the faintest hint of memory in his eyes. "Long time ago," he said softly. "Different sands, different winds." Those simple words struck the captain harder than any name or rank could have. He studied the veteran more closely now, the way his feet sank subtly into the gravel, the slow, controlled breath, and the relaxed set of his shoulders. Everything about him screamed experience. Not just military experience. Something deeper. Something forged in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. Riker swallowed, watching Hale's demeanor shift from formality to something almost reverent. The younger Marines leaned forward without realizing it, sensing the current pulling them toward something extraordinary. "Who trained you?" Hale pressed, voice lowering. The veteran's fingers brushed the brim of his faded cap, a gesture so small yet so significant it sent a ripple through the watching crowd. "Men who aren't around anymore," he answered. "Men who taught me what a rifle could really do." Riker's face drained a shade paler. Not because of the words but because of the tone. It wasn't pride. It wasn't arrogance. It was remembrance. And remembrance carried weight. Every Marine on that range felt a truth forming in the heat haze. Something legendary was taking shape right in front of them. For the first time, the captain's breath caught, because he recognized the ghost behind the man's voice. Captain Hale took a slow step back, not out of fear but out of dawning realization. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in memory. He had heard a voice like this before in stories passed between generations of shooters, whispered during late-night field exercises, and repeated with reverence in sniper school classrooms. Riker noticed the change instantly. "Sir, he's just some old civilian." But Hale silenced him with a single raised hand, never taking his eyes off the veteran. The wind shifted, carrying grains of sand across the firing line as Hale spoke carefully, each word pulled from a place deeper than procedure. "You were in Helmand, weren't you?" The veteran didn't blink. "A long time ago." Hale's pulse quickened. "And before that, the Karangal?" A silence fell so heavy it felt physical. Even Riker froze. Every Marine knew what the Karangal meant, one of the deadliest valleys on Earth, a place where legends were born in shadows and dust. The veteran finally exhaled, the faintest nod breaking years of secrecy. "Some folks called it that." A murmur rippled through the younger Marines like a shockwave. Hale's voice dropped lower still. "There was a man," he said, "a myth more than a Marine. Snipers studied his shots like scripture. A ghost who never missed. They said he trained entire platoons on nothing but instinct. They said he walked through fire and came back quiet." Riker's throat tightened. "That was decades ago," he muttered weakly. Hale straightened, eyes shining with clarity. "They called him Whisper Zero. The sniper whose rounds hit before you ever heard the shots." The air stopped moving. Every Marine stared at the veteran. And as he adjusted his sleeve, a faint, nearly invisible scar caught the sunlight, one that matched an old, classified briefing photo the captain had seen only once. The truth crashed into the range like thunder. The old man wasn't just a shooter. He wasn't just a veteran. He was the Marine Corps' most elusive legend, the ghost instructor still spoke about in reverent tones. Riker stepped back, color draining from his face as reality finally gutted him. The legend had been standing in the dust the whole time, watching them stumble. If reveals like this grip you, follow so you don't miss the next hidden chapter. For a long moment, no one moved. The range felt like a sealed room, the heat pressing down with the weight of the revelation that had just detonated between them. The younger Marines stood frozen, rifles limp in their hands, as if they suddenly realized they'd been pointing their weapons within breathing distance of living history. One lance corporal swallowed audibly, his throat bobbing as he stared at the man whose name instructors whispered only when the lights were low. Riker looked as if someone had ripped the spine out of his confidence. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a rattled breath, shaky and thin. The arrogance that had wrapped him like armor only minutes earlier now crumbled around his shoulders, leaving him exposed in a way that felt almost painful to watch. The veteran didn't look at him. He didn't have to. His presence alone, quiet, steady, impossibly heavy, forced Riker to confront every insult he'd thrown like a reckless rookie. The old man simply stood with the same measured calm he'd held since stepping onto the range, but now that calm felt different. It carried decades. Battles. Losses. Victories no one witnessed. Sacrifices no one recorded. Captain Hale's stare drifted between them, recognizing the emotional collapse unfolding in Riker's rigid frame. He had seen Marines break in combat, but this was something different. This was the shattering of ego when confronted with greatness. The younger Marines' respect shifted like a tide. Where there had been smirks and snickers earlier, there was now reverence, awe, and something close to protectiveness. The old legend hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded anything, yet the entire range bowed under the weight of who he was. And for Riker, that weight was unbearable. Riker's pride was cracking fast, but the consequences hadn't even begun yet. Captain Hale stepped forward with the controlled intensity of a man who understood exactly what kind of line had been crossed. The air thickened as he faced Riker, whose shoulders had already begun collapsing inward, the once cocky staff sergeant now looking smaller than any recruit on their first day of boot camp. Hale didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the cold precision of formal military discipline, the kind that sinks deeper than anger. "Staff Sergeant," he began, each syllable sharp as a knife edge, "do you have any idea who you just disrespected on my range?" Riker's jaw trembled. "Sir, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Hale snapped, stepping closer. "A Marine's job is to assess, observe, and recognize. You saw an old man. You didn't see the stance, the discipline, the presence. You didn't see a Marine." The younger Marines winced as if each word struck flesh. Riker's breathing grew fast and uneven. "You've embarrassed this unit," Hale continued, "and worse, you disrespected a man who's forgotten more about sniping than you've learned." Riker's eyes dropped to the gravel, shame burning so hot it felt like a second sun on the range. The veteran remained silent, watching the moment with that same calm dignity, refusing to fuel humiliation with revenge. It was that restraint, his refusal to strike back, that made the justice feel even heavier. Hale drew in a measured breath. "Staff Sergeant Riker, you're relieved of range command for the day. Report to my office afterward. We're discussing corrective action." A ripple traveled through the Marines. Justice had arrived quietly but unmistakably. And still, the old veteran hadn't spoken a single word of anger. Riker stood motionless, shame swallowing every inch of his posture, while the rest of the Marines kept their eyes locked on the legend standing quietly in the heat. The old veteran finally stepped forward, boots crunching over gravel in a slow, steady rhythm that felt like the closing of a long-forgotten chapter. He stopped beside Riker, not towering, not confrontational, simply present. The younger Marines held their breath. Even Captain Hale watched with a stillness born of respect. The veteran placed one hand on Riker's shoulder, the gesture impossibly gentle for a man forged in violent corners of the world. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly but warm with a calm that softened the sting without erasing the lesson. "Son," he said, "every sniper misses more than a target when he stops seeing the man in front of him." Riker's eyes glossed, his throat tight with remorse. He nodded once, sharply, accepting the wisdom more fully than any punishment Hale could deliver. Then the veteran turned, offering the Marines a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not superiority. Not pride. Just acknowledgement. A gesture that said they were still brothers, still part of the same lineage he had once given everything for. Hale exhaled, the tension finally starting to loosen. It wasn't forgiveness the old man had given, it was something heavier, something that would stay with them far longer. But the range still waited for one final truth before the legend walked away. If these moments hit your heart, follow so you never miss the next untold veteran story. The veteran took a few quiet steps toward the edge of the range, each footfall pressing deeper into the sand as though marking the last prints of a man who had walked battlefields no map could ever truly capture. The Marines watched him go in reverent silence, the sun casting his shadow long and thin behind him, like a final salute from the desert itself. At the boundary of the gravel, he paused just once, turning his head slightly so only the wind heard him. "Legends don't stay," he whispered. "They just make sure someone else learns to aim true." And then he walked on, fading into the heat, leaving every Marine on that range changed forever.